Welcome, everybody, to our Bible study in Isaiah chapter 21. We had a somewhat easy chapter yesterday, and now we've got another somewhat challenging chapter. This chapter is kind of written in like a poetic way, and we won't get into all the details about what all the expressions mean. We're just going to kind of hit the main ideas here. This chapter contains 3 oracles prophesying warnings against 3 different nations. And as far as our timeline today, we don't have an exact date for when these 3 oracles were spoken, but we do know that one of the key events that's prophesied in this chapter, the conquering of the Babylonians by the Medes, that happened in 539 BC. And when you think that Isaiah was prophesying late 700s, early 600s BC, this is like 150 years after Isaiah is dead and gone. So this is it's really a prophecy about the distant future. Key characters, most of these are going to be nations today. We have Isaiah, who is our prophet. We have the Babylonians. The Babylonian Empire dominated the world from 626 to 539 BC. The capital of Babylon was in Mesopotamia on not the Mediterranean Sea, the Euphrates River. And we have the Medes and the Elamites. They originated in the territory of what is now modern-day Iran or Iran. God used them to overthrow the Babylonians during the days of the prophet Daniel, which hopefully we'll study someday. Then we have Duma. This is another name for Edom. The Edomites were descendants of Esau, who was Jacob's brother, so they're actually relatives of the people of Judah. Edom was located to the south of the Promised Land. And then Arabia, an area that's not mentioned a whole lot in the Bible, but these were tribes, often nomadic, living within the Arabian Peninsula, and there's a short oracle about them at the end of the chapter. 2 quick words to give definitions for. First one is oracle, a divine announcement, a message from God. And the second one is to winnow. This appears in verse 10. It's to separate the good part of the grain from the bad part, the chaff. Farmers would have to do this before they stored up their grain and put it in their barns. So now let's get into these 3 oracles. The first one, verses 1 through 12, is against Babylon. Isaiah 21 begins with an oracle directed at the wilderness of the sea, and there's a lot of debate about why exactly it's called that, but in verse 9, it's clear that this title was a designation for the city of Babylon, the empire of the Babylonian Empire. And as I mentioned, the language in chapter 21 is very poetic, prophetically poetic, and for the sake of this study, we're just going to try to capture the main ideas, trying to decipher all of those phrases like wilderness of the sea and some of the other ones that we see. It would take us a long time, so just stick with the main points here. God was going to stir up the Elamites and the Medes against the country of Babylon. Isaiah, speaking here as if he were a citizen of Babylon when this calamity befell them, he spoke of the pain and the horror and the trembling of that day of judgment on Babylon. Isaiah was told to appoint a watchman to watch for the fulfillment of the Lord's words. And I don't think this is a literal watchman, but it's just the idea that the people are supposed to be watching for God's words to come true. And this watchman, we were told, he's supposed to keep his eyes on the horizon, looking for armies, looking for those Medes and the Elamites who are coming up against Babylon. And upon seeing the armies, he declared in despair, quote, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the carved images of her gods he has shattered to the ground." So sees the armies coming, sees how big they are, and he's like, oh, it's over for Babylon. And as we'll talk about in our application section today, there's a fulfillment of this that plays out later on in the Bible, in the prophet Daniel. Now, oracle number 2, verses 11 and 12, an oracle against Edom. So this next short oracle spoken by Isaiah was against Duma, which is another name for the kingdom of Edom. This oracle is challenging to understand, partially just because it's so brief. The people of Seir are pictured here. Seir was a prominent location within Edom, and they're calling out to their watchmen for the nightly report. And the watchman responded that the night was past, morning was coming, but that the light of the morning was soon going to be swallowed up by the darkness of night. And the meaning may be that Edom had escaped one threat, the first night, and there was this hope of the morning light, but that hope wasn't going to last them very long because there was going to be another threat that was brought upon them, perhaps a threat that was brought about by the judgment of the Lord on the nation of Edom, because we know that they weren't always faithful to God, and they didn't always treat their relatives in Judah very well. So, interesting oracle, but a very short one. Okay, and now number 3. An oracle against Arabia, verses 13 through 17. This oracle pictures the people of Arabia fleeing from enemies and hiding for their lives. They would be without bread and water as they fled from men with swords and drawn bows who were trying to kill them. God prophesied that within 1 year, the glory of Arabia would come to an end. So, ending there in verse 17, that wraps up our three oracles for today. And I want to go back to verse 5, which is within that oracle directed towards Babylon, to talk about our application section, which I've kind of retitled the Bible comprehension section today, because it's got more, it helps us just to understand God's work throughout the Bible story, more so than a modern day application. So, verse 5 contains a remarkable prophecy. It describes the men of Babylon feasting before their city was attacked. But the question would be, well, why would men be feasting if they knew that they were under some kind of threat of attack? Well, the only way that they would be doing that is if they're unaware of the threat, right? You wouldn't be partying when an enemy army is marching on your city unless you didn't know about the enemy army. As soon as the threat was finally realized, an order was given for all the men to prepare their weapons, or as said in the text, oil the shield. Now, this matches perfectly with the events that are described in Daniel 5, Daniel 5 takes place in 539 BC when these prophecies come to pass. The Babylonians were feasting the night that the Medes conquered their city. They are unaware of the danger. King Belshazzar of Babylon, quote, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine. So they were all drunk the night that the Medes marched on Babylon. And what we find out at the bottom of that chapter, verse 30 and 31, that very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom. So here we are, like 150 years out from this event, and Isaiah is prophesying this, and he's prophesying not only the kingdoms that are going to be involved and the nations that are going to rise to power, but also some of the finer details of the very night when the Medes conquer the city of Babylon. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully these comprehension sections will help us to make some connections between the prophets and the other books that actually contain the historical narrative of these events taking place. Because that can sometimes be a hard connection to make because there's just so much text and the information is spread across multiple books in some cases. So hopefully this will help out a little bit. That's our study in chapter 21. Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow to take on 22.